Hello everyone, it's Fjeller. So I know it's been a while since we made a video, but real life has been a little bit busy for me. But for now, let's take a look at these challenge fights that they gave us in the roguelike mode. Now, I actually ended up realizing that I never uploaded my challenge clears when I played this mode on the Chinese server, so I'm just gonna go ahead and post them alongside my clears on global. I know many of you probably already finished this mode and probably came up with your own strategies, but just for some context, on the Chinese server I used a more single target focused team, and on the global servers I used an AoE focused team. So at the very least, I will be showing you two very different ways to clear these challenge maps. Now, in my opinion, these challenge maps should not really be a problem at all if you are able to defeat the final boss of the roguelike mode. So on screen right now you can see the team I used on the Chinese server. I had a Freya tank, and I just stacked her with numerous damage reduction abilities. You can see that I gave her the Aryan Rod talent as well as the Juggler talent. I gave her the Lambda Forest aura so that she herself would always be in a forest tile. And because Freya is one of the very few, in fact I think the only tank that uses intelligence, I also gave her the heal spell so that when she was on her downturn she could also heal herself and lighten the burden on my healer. Although it's usually not necessary because, as you can see, I'm using both Liana and Rachel. I was not able to get Act Again in this run, but I did get Sea of Miracles on Liana, so she gets to pitch in by lowering everybody's cooldowns with that. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward single target team. You can see that Lamford is sort of my buffer. He not only of course has his talent, which increases everybody's stats, but he also has the Estelle 3-cost skill, which is probably the only reliable way to buff anybody in this mode, because the other buffing skills tend to have a much shorter duration, and faction buffs do not exist in this mode. And my starter DPS finally is actually Brenda. In my opinion, Brenda is amazing in this mode. If you give her Claret's Lightning Flash, she'll be hitting the Act Again threshold from her talent pretty often, so she's going to be attacking multiple times very often every turn. Now obviously you can do this combo on just about any character you want as long as you get the Brenda talent, but of course it's always about whether you get that drop or not. I also ended up getting Elwyn's talent on Brenda as well, so this really is the dream combination for a PvE Lancer DPS. And the nice thing is that I could always switch Brenda over to her cavalry class if I ever ran into some trouble with too many infantry units or something. Anyway, as you can see, this map is not that hard. The big thing is that you just need to play keep away because they will stun your tank. And unless you have range plus items like the Scepter of Divinity or the Oler's Bow, you will not be able to attack any of them safely due to their increased range. So that was the clear with my Chinese account. Let's take a look at how I clear it on the global server with my AoE team. So you can see here that I have Landius buffing instead. Very creative use of Landius there. But with that in place, let's just have everybody AoE dogpile them. So first we got Noemi here using Altina's AoEs. Altina's AoEs are actually really good, especially when you can combine it with a talent that doesn't suck. So next Helena comes in with the Phantom Raid. So you also notice that I put the fixed damage bonuses on my units as well. You can see that Helena has Rupture, and Noemi had the Eggbird talent. So for my global run, I had Wheeler as my healer. I was lucky enough to get Act Again this time, and having a 4-range Act Again is lots of fun, of course. So with that, this fight is pretty much over. So why don't we have Lusty come in and finish off Layden here. I gave her Grand Cross not because I think it's super effective or anything, but only because I think it's really funny to see a Lustral use Grand Cross. And as you can see from just that example, using AoE in this mode tends to make the fights go a lot faster. And in my experience that applies to pretty much the entire mode, now that I've played through it twice. The only exception being a couple of the boss fights. But anyway, now I have the second challenge playing, which I think is easily the hardest of the challenges, mostly because they were annoying about it and they decided to split the party into two halves on this map. Nevertheless, you can try to take advantage of that by also splitting up the enemy forces by baiting them to opposite sides of the map. One other annoying thing is that if you kill them, they will stun you, which makes hit and run tactics a lot harder to do here. And finally, if you try to outlast them somehow, they will just put an infinitely stacking damage debuff on you, and it's just they clearly don't want to take your time on this map. I think now is as good a time as any to mention the fact that the enemies for these challenge maps are actually randomized, or I guess it's more accurate to say that they're procedurally generated, which, well, it's roguelike, so that makes sense. But it also means that it's impossible to make a catch-all guide for these challenges. So for me, what makes sense on this map if you're going single target is to probably have a healer of some form on both sides of the map, and also to have revives on your characters. So as you saw, I actually had Ashram's Decimate on Brenda, so she can revive as needed, and I also have Indomitable equipped onto Freya for this map. Now obviously if you picked a tank in this mode that had a built-in revive like Elucio or Vargas, that makes this a lot simpler to do. And of course you can also just stack a bunch of revives if you really want to do that. Or better yet, if you manage to get the Virage talent, or get Virage himself, you can also make him a tank. But for me, the main takeaway here is that because these units have such high stats, unless you got like really perfect drops with damage reduction and talents and all that while you were playing the mode, it's a lot easier to accept the fact that these enemies are most likely just going to one-shot your units. So just have a revive around to negate that fact and then just heal up afterwards, and it isn't really a problem. Having some kind of Curse of Wounding or heal reversal attack on your side is also very handy, As you saw, I put Ash Glow Strike on Lamford here so that Yulia wouldn't give me that much trouble. Obviously you might not necessarily run into Yulia, but any sort of enemy that will self-heal a lot, like Elwyn, can be a real pain in the ass here. And of course heal blocks like Sword Soul are useful as well. But yeah, as you can see with a single target team, if you can safely bait them in and keep your units alive somehow, whether it's through a lot of stats or just through revives like I did here, you can slowly take them apart at your leisure. If your tank is strong enough, you can also try to weaken them to the point where your tank doesn't have to worry as much about being one-shot from the attacks afterwards. So just like the rest of them, I think there are numerous ways you can clear these maps. Although I will say that if you decide to crank up the difficulty, there is a difficulty slider that allows you to raise these stages to level 100 or whatever. That might narrow your options a bit, but there's pretty much no reason to do the level 100 versions of these challenge fights, unless you just enjoy them and you wanted to test out your team a little bit more. So right there is the single target clear of the second challenge of the roguelike mode on my trainees account. So now let's take another look at how I did it with the AoE team on the global server, and you may be shocked to learn that it looks very similar to the clear I did for the first challenge. So first we got Landius buffing again. So here I decided to start with Sword of Demise from Noemi instead of the defense lowering AoE. This is pretty much just so I can hit everyone. If I really needed the ones in the middle to die, then obviously I can still stick to the defense lowering one. And next we got Wheeler whipping somebody, which I'm sure is a fantasy for some of you, but feel free to keep that to yourself. But that whip makes Helena excited enough so that she can run over the entire mountain range, and just like in the first challenge, she is going to run in and bomb an AoE all over the enemy team and rupture them. So finally in comes Alestro with her shiny Grand Cross attack, and with that there's only 2 units left, so the rest of the challenge really shouldn't be an issue. Like I said earlier, these maps can have randomized enemies, so I cleared this map a couple times just to see what sort of combinations it might throw at me. In one of the combinations, it actually threw me 2 Shelf Anneals at once, which pretty much means that you need to kill them on turn 1 or whatever, otherwise they just AoE you and you die. So it is possible for the randomizer to give you a combination of enemies that make this close to unsolvable, depending on what kind of output you yourself have. But thankfully with that we're done with the second challenge, so let's move on to the third challenge. So for the third challenge, the most annoying thing is probably the desert terrain, although I will say that for single target teams this map is probably a lot more annoying than AoE teams, if only because when you're trying to rampage through them, they lower your unit's range by 2 if you attack them. So unless you have a bunch of units that attack 3 range, you're going to get units that are debuffed so that they cannot attack at all. With AoEs, they really don't run into this problem as much because even the targeted AoEs usually have a 3 range. The worst case scenario is usually just forcing you to run into your opponent's face before you cast the AoE. But otherwise, unlike the last challenge, because they don't really debuff your unit's stats in any meaningful way, you can actually tank the enemy's hits here, and it's a lot easier to do a safe approach to the map if you really want to. So the rest is really just hunting them down one by one, and if you're going single target, you just sit around waiting for the range reduction to go away. The only thing I will say against AoE for this map is because the enemies start spread apart way more than they do for the other maps, you can't just blow them all up turn 1 like I did with the other 2 maps. But yeah, otherwise this map, like I said, is a lot easier than the one before. So as I mentioned, this video is probably mostly just going to be for fun, because many of you probably had very different teams than I did. So if you came up with some kind of crazy build that you want to share with everybody, maybe you can comment below. But otherwise, I hope everyone enjoyed your Thanksgiving, and I hope you enjoyed this mode. Our next show should be coming out pretty soon, so stay tuned. I'll see you guys then.